I'm your producer, Todd Bartu, and this is the Offshore Explorer. Offshore Explorer looks at the world from the sailor's point of view, port by port. Together, we share stories that detail the important intersections between sailing culture and life, past, present, and future. Let me introduce our host, a lifelong sailor who has traveled the world, from mega yachts to tugboats to ice boats, and a published author who has written for both stage and screen, Captain Scott Dodgson.
Hello, Todd. How are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty great. What do we have in store for today's episode?
Well, today I'm going to talk about solo sailing and an experience of how I got into it and how it related to a couple of other endeavors that I do in my life, such as writing movies and sailing. So, yeah, it's kind of a combination, but I give some tips on how to set your boat up, as well as a couple of small things that make your life a little bit more comfortable when you're sailing long distance.
Great. Take it away, Scott.
I was sitting at a bar across from the Lahaina Marina in Maui, drinking a beer and watching the sunset. I was reflecting on the last 2 months and trying to summon the gumption for the next month and a half. I had sailed from Los Angeles as part of the Transpac race with my high school buddy, Tommy D. I had gotten Tommy into sailing when we were in high school. My 21-foot wooden sloop, Steppenwolf, was his first introduction to boats. He was now a news executive at ABC, and from what I understood through the vagueness of his corporate speak, he was being groomed for one of the top spots at the network. After high school and college, he had gotten into sailing, and sailing fit his corporate image. He loved to race, so he was really a racer. And this race was his first ocean race. He contacted me kind of out of nostalgia to help him. We raced an Olsen 30. It has a PHRF rating of 998. She's a ultra light mini sled, as I like to call her. She was very fast for her size, but very light, and giant sail plan. We had lost touch with each other for a number of years. He was married, had 2 kids, he lived in San Francisco. He was a bigwig in the corporate, and he had contacted my sister, who passed along my number. I was living an unconventional life. I was sailing and writing screenplays. I was skippering a Hinckley out of San Diego when the owner passed away and the family sold the boat. I made the last delivery to L.A. for the new owner. I was basically cast on the lee shore, as they say. While walking on the beach in Venice, I ran into a college friend, Willie. Willie was in my writing classes at UNCG. We got along really well in an environment that was more Shark Tank than collegial campus. Willie was a film producer at MGM. We walked down the beach. He asked if I had a couple of stories that might make great movies. I pitched him a couple of stories I was working on, and he liked them. My lee shore had just become my money shore. I wrote out the synopsis on 3 stories, and Willie paid me $15,000 for each story. I had 6 months to deliver the first script for another bonus, and so on for all 3 stories. This was a huge thing. Because later that day I was sitting in the hotel room. I had no car. I had no apartment because I'd been living on the Hinckley. My clothes were stuffed in a duffel bag, and a big fat check of $15,000 and contracts for more money. And I was so excited and so happy I didn't know what to do next. I called my sister to tell her the news. That's when she gave me Tommy D's number. This was just positive on top of positive. Tommy D had talked to my sister briefly, and between the two of them, they'd come up with this idea that I was destitute and homeless. Homeless, kind of, but I had dough. He devised a plan to have ABC pay me for a piece on the Transpac race and his adventure. He would get me enough money for the prep, the trip, and a stay in Maui, and the return trip. I was thrilled. I was pumped. The lee shore never felt so good. I called Willie and told him the news, and all he said was, call him when I got to Maui. Needless to say, I was flush with cash, and I'm from doing two things. The two things that I love to do, and that's writing and sailing. Tommy D had his boat, the Olsen. Tommy D had the boat trailered down from San Francisco. It's got a little skeg keel on it. It was a very nice little, Olsen is very fast, very small, and somewhat uncomfortable. We had a couple of days that we went out sailing, and just to kind of get the touch, we loaded the boat up with some food, all those things that you do when you go solo sailing. I know that there's a few things that I like to have with me when I'm solo sailing. That would be, of course, coffee. But I love to make this drink that I developed for myself when I was working as a reporter in New York, writing really as a columnist in New York for a newspaper, and local New York paper. And I used to cover events, and sometimes I'd be out. The event wouldn't start until 11, 12 o'clock at night. Sometimes I wouldn't even, I wouldn't get home until, 3, 4, 5, 6, easily, sometimes even 8 o'clock in the morning. This was a time of CBGBs and, Club 54, Studio 54, and all that kind of mania that was going in New York, which was kind of a really interesting time. And I'm sure I will write about in my memoirs at some point. But Tommy and I were prepping the boat, and I have this idea that I like to have a couple of shots of espresso and then some Baileys on ice over that. So the espresso makes me awake, and the Baileys sort of takes the edge off the coffee. I also like to have apples. I find eating, especially at night, when you get into, the dark 30 times of this is, difficult times, and kind of stay awake. An apple is always good. The sugar is good for you. So when you solo sail, always be aware of trying to keep yourself level. Not too much caffeine, not too much sugar, but just keep dropping little bits of it into your system, and it will maintain you until you get used to the attentiveness that you have to have when you're sailing. And as I said before, really have a great cushion to sit on and be secure for that. So we prepared for the race. We were ready to go. We had everything set, and we popped our spinnaker at the start time at the gun. I'd say the gun. There really wasn't any gun. And of course, all the big 65-footers and 70-foot sleds just exploded off the start line and took off. We did what we could do. We got up to our 7.5 knots with a spinnaker, sometimes 8 knots with a spinnaker, and we just sort of smoothed along. And I would maintain that spinnaker, jib, and mainsail for at least a week without barely touching the helm. So Tommy and I spent the first couple of days during the race, catching up and reminiscing, because there's a lot of dead time. I mean, I think this is the point that, a lot of people don't realize, is that solo sailing and sailing in general over long distances, it's like you create your own little world, right? You keep doing this, you do that, you do this. Maybe watch a movie. You could, you cook, you read, etc. You keep going on with this. Is anything to keep yourself occupied, as well as, do the boat. So after we had caught up, and we were about a week out. Tommy D began to get sick. He had the flu. He surmised he had gotten it from his kids, and he was really struggling. He was throwing up. We had talked about turning around. He didn't want to turn around. It would have been a tough beat to get back, and we probably would have had to closest land was probably Mexico, probably Puerto Vallarta at this point, and it was a good distance. It was almost futile to turn around and go back and or go in that direction. But I kept him hydrated and fed, and he could barely sit up. And certainly he couldn't do watch. He tried to do watch one night, and I gave him like 10 minutes, and he was out. So I said, go downstairs, tuck yourself in, throw some sails. And we had a lot of sails, so there was plenty of sails in the boat to sort of nestle yourself into. And he went off and slept and woke occasionally, get a good night's sleep. But basically, he left the race to me, and I carried on. And it was a really, really great experience for me in terms of adapting, and even though he was there on the boat, I was really, single-handing the boat. And I enjoyed it. I was becoming addicted to it, and I was excited. So one of the activities that I kept doing to stay awake, because I was doing all the watches, I literally camped myself off in the cockpit. And my main thing is keeping the speed of the boat, morning, noon, and night, and keeping the sails trimmed. They would get out of trim fairly easily, and it took a lot of attention to kind of find that sweet spot, because these light boats have a tendency to get tossed around on the waves, and you get a lot of luffing up and all kinds of crazy stuff happening to your sail plan. But once I got things sort of settled, the Olsen she started to really, find its rhythm on the ocean. And that's sort of in solo sailing. That's one of the things that gives you the best alert and indication. You get into a rhythm, and you can feel the rhythm, and you're going and going and going, and you're feeling the rhythm all the way along. And then if you go to sleep, which you're going to go to sleep, if that rhythm changes, you'll wake up immediately. And it's kind of a cool thing, but I know a lot of people don't talk about solo sailing in the sense that, the boat's rhythm is really primary to the safety of the boat and to hearing if there's any sort of disaster. But one of the things I did just to keep my mind alert was to keep reading. So I had brought along Joshua Slocum. And this was sort of inspirational piece. And he writes, I had resolved on a voyage around the world. And as the wind on the morning of April 24th, 1895, was fair, at noon I weighed anchor, set sail, and filled away from Boston, where the Spray, his boat, had been moored snugly all winter. The 12 o'clock whistles were blowing, just as the sloop shot ahead under full sail. A short broad was made up of the harbor on a port tack. Then, coming about, she stood to seaward, and her boom, well off to port, swung past the ferries and lively heels. A photographer on the outer pier of East Boston got a picture of her as she swept by, her flag at the peak, throwing her folds clear. A thrilling pulse beat high in me. My step was light on the deck in the crisp air, and I felt there could be no turning back, and that I was engaging in an adventure, the meaning of which I thoroughly understood. It's beautifully written stuff. His book is, if you've not read Joshua Slocum's Adventures of Spray, you have to. He literally was going to go down the Suez Canal to get into the Indian Ocean. But he realized when he got to Gibraltar that going across the southern Mediterranean would be too dangerous for a lone sailor, because at the time, in 1895, there were still a lot of pirates. So he headed to Brazil. This is a pretty standard practice, to go from, to cross the Atlantic and then head south and to the Straits of Magellan, out towards Brazil. He eventually made his way to Australia. He sailed north along the east coast, crossed the Indian Ocean, and rounded Cape of Good Hope, and then headed back to North America. And for all you guys that are contemplating going sailing and ocean sailing, he did this without a chronometer, without GPS, and he used a traditional method of dead reckoning for longitude, which required a cheap tin clock for the approximate time and noon sun sights for latitude. So he shot the noon sun when he could. On one long passage in the Pacific, Slocum was famously shot some lunar distance observations. And these observations, they checked and gave a separate and independent verification of his longitude. But his primary method for finding longitude was still dead reckoning. And so he sailed the Spray. Actually, he claims in his book that he sailed the Spray without touching the helm, due to the length of the sail plan relative to the heel and the long keel. This is interesting because we don't have the kind of long boom sail plans that they did back then. There was that sloop design was just take your boom and add another 6 to 8 feet to it, no matter what the size is, and it's that percentage is what he's really talking about. And of course, being full keeled also helped his boat in terms of its steering. My CT had a full keel, and regardless of what the weather, she was very stable in terms of holding her course. So anyway, he had a long keel, and he was capable of self-steering. Basically, he would tie off the helm and set the sails, and or as they say, lashing the helm fast. And in this instance, he sailed over 2,000 miles, 3,200 kilometers, west across the Indian Ocean without once touching the helm. This is really kind of the solo sailing sailor's dream, where you don't have to touch anything and you just go. And I would say for all the distances that I have done, and I mean, I'm in the middle of talking about the Hawaiian story, and this, I sailed to the Caribbean from Bermuda by myself, from New York to Bermuda by myself, from the Caribbean to Bermuda and New York by myself, from the Azores into the Med by myself, and numerous other shorter distances, 40, 50, 100 miles round trips. Mexico, I did several trips to Mexico by myself. And if you're a delivery skipper, this kind of stuff happens. This is what you do. So when Slocum returned, he returned June 27th in 1898. And this is 3 years. He had circumnavigated the world. A distance of like 46,000 miles or 74,000 kilometers. And when he returned, he was almost unnoticed, because at the time, the Spanish-American War, which was going on, kind of grabbed all the headlines. And it wasn't until he published some of his stories that people began to find out about his amazing adventure. Which, in the time of internet and looking at other people that are doing solo sailing and stuff like this, I did a lot of my sailing pre-internet, and even if I was on the internet, I wasn't making things public about the trips I was making. I mean, it wasn't anything to think that I could go on a 1,000-mile round trip sailing by myself or sailing solo and getting, and not saying a word to anyone. It was just like, okay, this is like normal stuff. It's like, okay, I'm going down to the grocery store. See you later. But I just wanted to bring up the solo sailing idea, and especially to thank or especially to congratulate Yannick Besthaven. He just won the Vendée Globe, and he did a amazing job. It took him 80 days. Imagine 3 years versus 80 days. 13 hours, 59 minutes, and 46 seconds. His time, he had a compensation time of 10 hours. And his course took him 28,583 nautical miles with an average speed of 14.78 knots. That's flying. That's flying. And in this race, as I followed it, they had a lot of quiet days in this race that could have gone faster. I think the world record is, and correct me if I'm wrong, you can send me a message. I think the world record is like 74 days or something like that. I'm not quite sure. This has always been, the Vendée Globe has always been one of those races when I was much younger that I really wanted to do, but I could never get all the sponsorship, and it's an expensive race. Obviously, you're not spending anything while you're racing, but all the boats are, these boats have foil keels. They're high tech in every possible way, and a lot of these high tech items and travelers and sails and booms and staysail, all this kind of stuff, eventually gets translated into the navigation instruments, everything that they develop for these boats to race today in the Vendée Globe. Eventually find their way to the market, and Joe Blow boat handling, sailing captain can get a hold of them. So anyway, let me just kind of go back to the idea of what we're talking about here. When you go solo sailing, you need to set up the boat, and you need to set it up so you can handle it by yourself. Now, one of the things that's really important here is you have to be able to do everything on the boat if you're going to go out and solo sail. And ironically, a lot of people go out by themselves. I mean, I know guys who I've had conversations with. It's like, oh yeah, I would never go solo sailing, but he can take his boat out of the dock by himself, go over to the fuel dock, fuel up, turn around and come back, go in the dock. And I said, well, those are two of the most difficult things you have to do when you're in a boat is docking and undocking your boat. The rest of it is just sailing. Okay. So one of the goals is to make sure you keep everything as simple as possible. Most boats today, all the lines and everything run back into the cockpit, and you have auto helm. And auto helm is a huge important thing, so you don't have to be steering at the same time as handling the lines, because you can screw yourself up. And it's actually, advice wise, even if you have somebody on the boat who is not an experienced steering person and you're having a hard time in some difficult weather and waves, and you need to go out on the foredeck for whatever reason to untangle your furler or fix something up there, or bring down a sail if it's a hank-on sail, whatever the case may be, you're better off having the auto helm work for you than having somebody who's inexperienced in steering. I have more times than not been airborne, like an elevator with the bow going up and then the bow crashing down, because the person steering wasn't paying attention to what I was doing and was looking around and got off course, where with the auto helm will keep you precisely on course. So this is an important thing. And then you have to ask yourself, can I do a couple of things by myself? Can you reef your mainsail by yourself? Is the spinnaker pole going to be too much for you to handle? That's a big one, because in ocean racing, you're going to use a lot of spinnaker. And in regular cruising crossings by yourself, you can always elect not to put the spinnaker up if it appears to be too dangerous. But most of us are going to put the spinnaker up in a kind of seriously a downwind. We're not going to need it's going to be easier on deck, not too much pitch, not too much roll, and you're going to be able to set the spinnaker by yourself. But it's important that you go through this process with the spinnaker pole. There's a number of other chutes you could use that don't use the spinnaker pole, and, like a Zero and these things. You could use these or not use those. It depends. And if going to go wing to wing by yourself, make sure that the environment is right. These guys that race in the Vendée Globe, when you see them out with a spinnaker and a 35 knot wind going downhill like 40 miles an hour, okay, these guys are super professional. They've done this a million times. And not only have they the experience, and you may actually get the experience through your passage of time and practicing it and this, that, and the thing. These guys are superior athletes. They're really great athletes. So, think about it in that regard, because fatigue is a huge problem with solo sailors until you learn how to manage it. And this is very, very important. You may look at some basic stuff like moving the halyard clutch, or to a bit more involved, such as converting a single line reefing system. A single line reefing system is convenient where it's possible, but even adding a reef tack line and jammer back to the cockpit can be even better. It requires less line, and it ends up, being tangled in the cockpit. The goal of single-handed sailing is to make the boat easy to sail. So if you go to like your local loft, you can get all sorts of ideas. You have sail loft, and they can help you out quite a bit. But, racing or shorthand sailing, solo sailing, has become really a big thing. I mean, roller furling head sails came from this. Canting keels all came from shorthand racing. There's a more kind of robust upwind, true wind, broad reach kind of idea going on, that these systems and these sail handling systems, like a top-down spinnakers and furlers, electric winches, code zeros, all these are examples of hardware and sails that originated from offshore racing. So one of the things I recommend is to use a releasable inner forestay with hanks and make that your head stay and reef friendly. It's a great kind of emergency thing, as well as, if you really have to reef down, this is a better way to do it, because your furler is not going to work and it's probably going to explode at some point, which they all seem to do for some unknown reason. And just make sure that you have enough reefs in your sails. Sometimes the sails have to be resewn and re-engineered so that you can have little reefs. My boat, my CT, was a ketch, and I used to keep the staysail up a lot because it was a very small sail up on the bow. I would reef the mainway down, and then I would reef the mizzen sail. And I could pretty much ride out any storm with that. And I had the main could be reefed down almost to a postage stamp. And it worked really, really, really well. And if it was just a little too much, I could take I could drop the main. Now, for that boat, most of the lines did not run into the cockpit. So for the mainsail and for the staysail and for the jib / genoa, I had to go up on deck and pull them down myself because they were hank-on sails. Kind of the old-fashioned way of doing it. But that's why I always think of the physical occupation of a sailor, and I always imagine in my last podcast, the Aubrey Maturin series, of guys, climbing up these masts and, getting way out and bringing in sails by hand and standing on a line. I can walk the deck. But one of the important things is safety for the solo sailor. So really, really consider that you should have your jack lines. You should have straps running all the way down so you can just walk back and forth and keep your harness on. There's a lot of famous stories about people who fell overboard, experienced sailors. Try not to be one of those stories. Make sure that you have the right sort of equipment. Some of you have seen some of our stuff that we advertise for, which is Mustang Survival. Great kit, super reliable, and these are the kinds of things that you need to have on your boat, and you need to be wearing. So there's all sorts of pros and cons, like different styles of deck vests and stuff. But I like the little thin ones. The Mustang Survival. Musto has another one. You can work in them. They work very, very well. And then the second thing is after you have all your jack lines, your safety lines, get a vest. Make yourself comfortable in the cockpit. Make sure you have some really solid cushions. I know one of the biggest things that I ever did is I bought, and they were somewhat expensive, closed cell foam, about 3 inches, and I put them in my cockpit, and they wouldn't get wet. They would get wet, but you could sit on them, and they would dry very quickly. And they provided a lot of comfort. And I had a bunch of pillows that I could bring out and sort of tuck behind myself so I can keep my eye on the horizon, look for ships, and keep my eye up on the sails and keep everything going in the right direction. But comfort is an important thing. Another little trick that I always did is pacing myself what I ate. I would try to have a big meal, maybe 2 big meals, but that would be always during the day, never at night, because after you eat a big meal, you kind of want to fall asleep. So daytime is a great time to get as much food in you. And remember, you're just filling yourself up. It's just energy. So carbs are welcome. If you're constantly on a diet or something, when you go sailing, you're going to use so much energy and so many carbs. Literally, I have lost 10 pounds in a crossing. And I have eaten like a horse throughout the whole time. But it's the constant movement of the boat. And the second thing that really I want to tell everybody to make sure that you have a first aid kit at hand. All right. If you can get some, like the spray Novocaine stuff, for bumps and bruises, that's very helpful. You might find having dental stuff that you could put in your mouth to help with teeth. For some reason, people always have teeth problems when they're out sailing solo or sailing by themselves. And of course, there's the whole, get seasick, seasick pills, Dramamine, etc. Honestly, I think your body gets used to the seasickness. Once you get past a couple of days on the boat, it probably won't affect you as much. It won't be as severe. But a big old box of ginger snap cookies will help. Ginger has always been the Chinese remedy for seasickness, and it's kind of important. At night, I used to make espresso. This was a very famous. This is a drink that I used when I worked in New York as a writer for a magazine in New York. I spent a lot of nights out going to clubs and stuff like that to write about the clubs and art openings and stuff. And I was often up to 2, 3, 4, 5 o'clock and 6 o'clock in the morning, sleep a couple hours and go. But one of the things I did was when I went to these clubs and stuff, I couldn't drink because I was there to write about what I was observing. And so I kind of developed this drink, which was espresso, couple shots of espresso on ice with a little Baileys. And, stir that up, put that in your cup. And even without the ice, I like the ice because it melts eventually and it makes it a little less. I like the idea that the espresso is going to keep you up and the Baileys is going to just take the edge off of that coffee high. And I used to do that. Apples was one of my favorite at night kind of thing. Crunchy, sweet, sugar, sort of keep you up a little bit. And this is purely my taste, Starburst. I used to buy big bags of Starburst, and that way I could keep them in my pocket, Starburst. I'm sitting up on deck, and if I just need something to chew on, that always worked out really well for me. And I mean, you probably have your own likes and dislikes for, stimulants to keep you awake. And the point I'm trying to make is don't overstimulate, because when you overstimulate, then you're going to be exhausted. You got to find the right sort of balance of a little bit of sugar versus, going through a diabetic coma. That kind of stuff is really important. And then the next thing I would say is to make sure you have a great communication plan. Tell the people, your friends, your family, where you're going to sail, how you're going to sail, what's your rough estimate of time of arrival. And there's so many other things that you can add. Your AIS transponder could be there. And a lot of people, what they do is they put on their AIS transponder, their call sign, they change it to Solo Sailor and then your name. So mine would be Solar Sailor Scott or Scott Dodgson. All right. You load all your Navionics maps in. Don't forget extra battery packs. Make sure Wi-Fi in the middle of the ocean doesn't work. Just so you know. Your cell phone isn't going to work. Just so you know. Look at it. A lot of guys can get a shortwave radio. I used to have a shortwave radio on my boat, in which I could talk to the nets all over the world. And if you've ever read John Hawke's book, Outer Bridge Reach, I highly recommend it. That's a great sailing story, very sad, very true story, but incredibly well written. Just an amazing book. It's called Outer Bridge Reach. It's probably something you should read if you're a sailor. Outer Bridge is up in Jersey, around New York. So don't forget extra batteries. And before you go out, I know that when we did the Transpac, we had to take a safety at sea course that they put on for the for the Transpac, and even the Newport Bermuda race on the East Coast does the same thing. So going solo doesn't mean going it alone. And so make sure that you stay in touch with people, and there's a great community of sailors. And make sure the person that you're staying in touch with is not like, it's like your wife who thinks, okay, yeah, he's at the sailboat. I have no idea where the marina is, and I don't know what to do. Give her a list of things to call if there's a problem. All right, or have a friend who really knows what they're doing. Somebody in your yacht club or somebody who you sail with. Keep them informed so they can watch what you're doing. I mean, even today, I have friends. Many of you listen to the Tommy Twang interview, and I track Tommy's progress all the way down Mexico through the Gulf, through the Panama Canal, and up into Houston. I followed him all the way. I didn't talk to him all the time, but I knew where he was, and it was, it's very, very important. So I go back to sitting at the bar in Maui, and, quite honestly, I kind of didn't want to leave. So I did contact Willie, and literally Willie flew over to Maui, and we just hung out and talked about stories. We had a great time. We had a really, really great time. And he was an interesting guy. I gave him all 3 synopsi for the 3 movies. And I might mention to those people that are thinking of screenwriting, this age I'm talking about was one of the best ages for a screenwriter. You could write an idea down on a napkin and end up getting dough for it. There was such a need for this. From producers, and producers they were mining, looking for the right script and looking for all, what to do with the next movie, because it was just the right thing to do for them. But that time has changed. It's become more corporate. It's more difficult to get a movie made. The process is much more difficult to get a screenplay. You could have the greatest screenplay. It could be formatted perfectly. Everything could be technically perfect on the script. And all that's going to get you is into the pool with the pros who have been doing it for a long time. And the way to break out on screenplays like sailing is you got to go it alone. You got to make your movie. You got to have all the skills to write it, to hopefully manage to direct it or produce it. All of these things you have to get. I don't think today you can be just a screenwriter and get stuff done. I think you're just kidding yourself if that's what you're going to do and pinning your hopes on it. Whereas a solo sailor, he has to know everything. He's got to be a mechanic. He's got to do that. And I want to mention one thing about that is that I used to run my engine, by the way, every day to charge up my batteries. And I always used to, I had a schedule, but I used to always try to find a time when the winds were really light so that I could motor during that period and, make up like a course correction or make up, a few miles that I thought I should have. And this is, rather than sitting in the doldrums, run. But if you take the number of days you expect to be out on a trip, like for the trip coming from, it took us 28 days to go from the west coast of California to Maui for the Transpac. Tommy got to feeling better. The last 2 or 3 days, he really wasn't on top of his game even then. The motion of the boat and all the rest of the stuff, it really knocked him down. He was literally sick for 2 weeks with the flu, okay, which was like the middle 2 weeks of our trip. And the last week or so, I think 8 days or so, He could take watches and stuff like that. But that taught me that I could solo sail by myself. I could do that, and it was kind of really cool. And I loved it. I loved being out there. It was challenging, and it was, it was just one of those things that once you get hooked into doing it, it's very highly addictive and extremely satisfying. So Willie came out, we got the boat in. Tommy was, he had to hop on a plane to go back to actually New York. He left me a couple of Hawaiian shirts and stuff like that, and left me a couple of gifts. And he said, don't worry about whatever you're going to write or whatever the case may be. And he took off. And the marina, the slip, it was a temporary slip. We were in it, so it was temporary for a couple of weeks. And this time that I'm sitting there having a beer, Willie had come. He'd spent 3-4 days with me. We had talked about stories and this, that, another thing, and where we were. Made some changes, and he literally took the 3 synopsi back to Los Angeles with him. We had a wonderful time, and I had more money waiting for me when I got to Los Angeles. He was going to give me checks when I got there. And my question is whether I was going to jump on this boat, this Olsen 30, and take it back to San Francisco by myself. I actually started looking for people. Couldn't find anybody. It's also a problem when you do a lot of deliveries and transit a lot of boats. It's hard to find good crew. But I decided to, after my experience, because I was realizing there was a sort of addiction with this, so I decided to do it by myself. And I took the boat by myself from Maui to San Francisco. I did that in 31 days. I have to say that I'm an outgoing person, but I was really happy to talk to people when I got there. And I came into San Francisco, and literally that was the first time I'd ever sailed underneath San Francisco, the Bay Bridge there, and which was cool. And just parked the boat. Tommy met me at the dock, and we said hello, goodbye. I've never seen him since that day. And I picked up my duffel bag and my little portable typewriter, which I used throughout the whole trip. And I got on a bus, and I went back to Los Angeles. And for the life of me, I couldn't figure out why I was going back to Los Angeles. Basically to pick up checks, that was the reason. But there was nothing in, I had made the contacts for the writing career, so there was nothing really other than that in Los Angeles. I did hook up with Willie. The films, by the way, never got made, which is something as a screenwriter you should probably know. Chances of getting made are even more remote than you getting paid for your writing. But anyway, I ended up at that point going to back to New York, and I ended up taking a boat at a delivery, a 45-foot something, and down to the Caribbean. And Caribbean, I ran into my love, which was my CT-54, and began 20 years of chartering and sailing around the world with that beautiful boat. And the one thing that I guess that there's 2 pieces of advice here. One is if you go solo sailing, you're gonna destroy the world you live in. You're just gonna love it so much that you just can't get enough of it. And second, the hardest part of the journey of solo sailing is not having anyone to share the good moments with you. That's the hardest part. Other than that, I find being out on the sea to be the most a humbling and warm and lovely feeling in myself as a human being of anything I have ever done in my life. Thank you for listening, and I'll look forward to your comments and questions. We can talk more about solo sailing and single-handed short sailing, whatever you want to call it. Don't take it lightly. Prepare it. Don't do it without some kind of assistance. And consider yourself warned. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing, Scott. That was an interesting story. What is the thing that is the most difficult task of sailing solo?
Well, I think, I think everybody thinks that sailing solo is this constant, work and trimming sails and just on and on and on. Basically, it's kind of fighting boredom to a certain extent. There's a lot to do. You have as a solo sailor, you have a little schedule in your head, and you're always on the lookout for other vessels, especially if you're in any sort of shipping lanes. But as long as you have your systems up, and your most boats will have radar, and you have a warning system. So if anything comes within 15 nautical or 20 nautical miles of you, the warning will go off, and you can look at it. I think sleep deprivation is maybe the second thing. Once you kind of get used to only sleeping a couple, 20 minutes here and 20 minutes there, best to sleep, if you're going to sleep, is in the middle of the day when the sun is high. That way you can your boat will be seen even though you may not see them. I remember once I was in the cockpit. I was sleeping. I was taking a boat from the Azores to Italy, and I was doing it by myself, solo sailing, and I was tucked in the little corner outside, and everything was doing fine, and I just dozed off for like a second. Oh, at least I thought it was for a second. And it was really warm. And I woke up, and I looked around, and there was a Chiquita banana boat, like giant ship, like 100 yards from me, going in the same direction. He just passed me. And it was like, he was like right there. I was like, whoa, I almost got hit by a banana. Yeah, but there's all sorts of, and the thing is I was awake. My radar didn't go off. The alarm didn't go off. So I was like completely like upset by that. It had worked before other times, but this time it didn't. And the third thing that sometimes is when you get tired is you begin to have sort of this optical illusion thing going on when you're at sea. You start seeing stuff. And I remember once I saw this light, and I thought it was a ship. And it could have been a ship. And it was, we're kind of in the shipping lanes, and it could be this. It could be that. And the light kept getting brighter and brighter and brighter. And I said, man, I checked my radar. I had nothing on my radar. And I'm thinking, oh, this piece of radar crap isn't working right. And, I should reboot it and do a diagnostic. And I keep looking at this really, really bright light. And I was convinced this was some kind of big ship with a big giant light going on it. But it wasn't. It was the moon rising through the clouds. Freaked me out. But anyway, that's what delirium can do. So that's something you fight, and the only way you can fight delirium is shut your eyes and go to sleep for a good hour, get some REM sleep, and then you'll be up and going. But the longer you do it, the easier it becomes.
Yeah. So what do we have planned for next week's episode?
Well, next week I thought we would do something a little bit more interesting. A place that a lot of people talk about and surprisingly, a lot of people don't go to because they have a lot of misconceptions about it, and that is the Principality of Monaco. I have been in Monaco many, many times, and I'm going to talk about some of the trips I've made there. And really, if you're a cruiser and you got a little extra money, it's not cheap, but it's within line of all the rest of the marinas up and down the Côte d'Azur. And but it's also one of the most fascinating places. It's a great place to go out to eat. It's just a really interesting place. And the one thing that most people don't know about Monaco is that a majority of Monaco is underground. There are escalators that go here and go there, and everything is tunnels and shopping centers that are underground. It's a lot of fun, and it's really interesting. And, of course, we have F1, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And if you've ever wondered how you get your yacht on the quay for F1, I will recount a few of the stories. I've done it a number of times. So next week, Monaco.
Thank you for tuning in. If you like this episode, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Also, be sure to rate and review. You can find us on Facebook and at offshoreexplorer.org. You can also listen to past episodes at offshore-explorer.simplecast.com. Our theme song is sung by Paulette McWilliams, with additional music by Amanu Itomi and Tommy Twang.
Until next time, fair winds and calm seas.